Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Koki Mendes. I'm Communications Director here at Political Research Associates. We're the publisher of Religion Dispatches. This is More Kosher Than You Think, a roundtable discussion on Anti-Zionism, hosted by Religion Dispatches. For 16 years, Religion Dispatches has been the online home for critical discourse and examination of the relationship between religion, power, and culture. Religion Dispatches is not a religious publication. It is a publication on religion for those who wish to examine the role that religion plays in our lives and in our politics. Religion Dispatches was acquired in 2021 by publisher Political Research Associates, a research and strategy center that monitors and strategizes against the US and global far right. Our moderator for today's conversation is Marissa Kabis, a Brooklyn-based independent journalist. She's the writer and creator of The Handbasket, a subscriber-supported newsletter and news site. She's also a contributing columnist for MSNBC.com and has appeared on air. And Marissa's going to drop her handles in the chat if you would like to follow her. We hope you do. Marissa, thank you so much for moderating this conversation for us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for joining us for More Kosher Than You Think, a roundtable discussion on anti-Zionism. I just wanted to note one important thing at the top. We're not here to argue semantics about when anti-Zionism is and isn't anti-Semitic. We understand that personal relationships to Israel are historically and spiritually complicated, but the increasingly horrific situation on the ground in Gaza has made it harder to deny that opposing the Israeli government's actions isn't just tenable, but morally just. And as you'll hear from our panelists, it's also very much grounded in Jewish theology. While the international discourse around the genocide in Gaza is clear and resolute, here in the United States, there remains a bit of tension between the very clear state violence with the idea of Israel as a Jewish safe haven. We're not having this conversation to argue the facts or framing of the anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism argument, but rather to delve more deeply into the history that has been lost in superficial conversation, flippant op-eds, and social media posts. So now let me introduce our wonderful panelists. I'll start with Seth L. Sanders, who is a professor of Jewish Studies and Religious Studies at UC Davis and a Guggenheim Fellow, author or editor of 5 books, including Ancient Jewish Sciences, Cuneiform on Canaan, and The Invention of Hebrew. The grandchild of Ukrainian Jewish refugees who fled pogroms in the early 1900s, his bar mitzvah study with Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf and his postdoctoral studies of Jewish history and theology at Hebrew University continue to shape his thinking about the ideas and realities of Israel. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you, Marissa.
And last but certainly not least, we have Shaul Mayid, a visiting professor of modern Judaism at Harvard University, where he is also a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions. His rabbinical ordination is from Jerusalem in 1984. He is the author of many books and essays, most recently, The Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament, Elijah Tzvi Soloveitchik's commentary to the New Testament. So thank you so much for both being here. And I would love it if we could just dive into some questions. So let's kick off with this one. Can you describe the Jewish theological prerequisites for living in Israel and how that understanding has provided a central narrative for early Jewish history in what is now Palestine and Israel?
So maybe I can say one thing as the more Hebrew Bible ancient focused person, and Shaul has far greater expertise in rabbinic as well as modern Jewish thought, could add the dimension of most of Jewish history. But in the Bible, the idea is that God, through an act of pure sovereign divine choice, picked a Babylonian guy. It says that the Eretz Moladto, your native land, is Ur Chasdim, that is Ur in Babylon. That's where Abraham and his parents are from. He takes them, he says, you know what, I'm going to give you Israel, Eretz Yisrael, as long as you follow every bit of the covenant. If you do, nobody can stand before you. You're going to kill most of the natives. You're going to drive them out. It's going to be yours, but you have to follow all of these commandments, and then they're listed in various places, Deuteronomy being one key one, and it says if you don't follow them, if you are not righteous, if you oppress the stranger, if you take from the widow or the orphan or the weak, then here's what I'm going to do. And there follows, especially in Deuteronomy, a savage set of predictions and punishments, including most prominently being driven out of the land of Israel, losing the right to that. So the dominant voice in the Bible, in the prophetic tradition, as well as in the Torah, is that it is highly contingent. And there's to summarize, maybe you could look at Amos, you could look at Deuteronomy, you could look at Kings, but it says, if you really mend your ways in Jeremiah 7 and your actions, if you do justice between one person and another, if you do not oppress the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, if you do not shed the blood of the innocent in this place, if you do not follow other gods, then only will I let you dwell in this place, in the land I gave to your ancestors. So there's that that biblical basis anyway. Now, in fact, as Shul has written, there are some very intense reinterpretations, changes, and even ruptures that have happened.
Thanks, Seth. That's a good intro. So to take off on that, what we today, and wherever one sits within the kind of spectrum of Jewish life, called Judaism, is really a product of the diaspora. It's a product of what the rabbis constructed as a deterritorialized religion after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Now, the land of Israel as a Jewish homeland, the language of Jewish homeland, of course, is a modern one, but the land of Israel is as a land that eventually Jews will return to, was always deeply embedded within that religion, within that rabbinic mindset that then goes back to Jewish history. But it was always aspirational, and it was always dependent upon some kind of redemptive period or the coming of the Messiah, however one understands that. It's not to say that the land of Israel wasn't considered to be holy even in its exilic state. It was, and Jews went there for pilgrimages, and Jews went there to die and be buried, and Jews went there to do all kinds of things. But generally speaking, the idea of a return, a mass return to the land of Israel was seen as something that, as the Talmud speaks about in the famous teaching at the end of Tractate Sanhedrin, was considered to be blasphemous before its time, right? The return in mass, kachoma is the language, as a wall. So the return in mass of the Jews to the land of Israel before the Messianic time was considered to be prohibitive. And that really kind of continues throughout the normative rabbinic tradition, even into early modernity. And at a certain point in time, there began this move to think about what it would be like to establish some kind of a political reality within this Jewish homeland. Then that's called Zionism. And that emerges really in Western Europe in the mid-19th century, at the same time that modern nationalism was emerging. So in that sense, I think that there's a lot of people that want to say that, oh, Zionism goes back to the Hebrew Bible, it goes back to the ancient world. I mean, I think that Zionism is a movement of Jewish self-determination, a nationalist movement of self-determination that is a product of Western and Central European nationalism more generally. And in some way, on this question of the prohibitive nature about, well, what about the prohibition of returning before the age of the Messiah? I think on some level, because most Zionists early on were secular, on some level, Zionism is really abandoning that idea, and to the point where the Jews, after the pogroms of the 1880s and the 1890s, just basically began to say, okay, we're done waiting. We're not waiting for this messianic promise. We're going to just do it ourselves. And then, religious figures come in and start to reinterpret that itself is part of the Messianic era. So Messianism kind of filters into Zionism, but it's really not at its core in any religious sense. So you have this movement that is modern. It's focused on human agency. It's about the normalization of the Jew, right? To be like the other nations. That's kind of the mantra in some way of Zionism. And there was a lot of pushback within traditional Jewish communities to that idea.
Yeah, and there's a fantastic book that was originally published in Hebrew, Haketza Megoleh, by Aviezer Revitsky, who was the head of the Department of Jewish Thought at Hebrew U. And he lays this stuff out very clearly and in great detail, that the the most theologically conservative of Jews in the 19th, 20th, and then and Shul's pretty expert on the holdouts, the Satmar, but they said, look, in the Talmud, it says you can't do this. In Maimonides, the single greatest interpreter of Jewish law, it says you can't do this. So, we're going to stick to the old theological view here. And I'll add one little point to the theological reinterpretation of godless secular nationalism that initially repelled so many of the very orthodox, saying, how can we have a nation of Israel, a state of Israel, God forbid, without the Torah and the commandments, as one ultra-Orthodox sage wrote around 1900. The idea that, well, actually the nationalism too is God's doing. The secularism is actually God working behind the scenes. The godlessness is itself God. This is a lot like Hegel. So someone like Rav Kook, who's the first Rav Kook, who's the greatest thinker probably of this theological nationalism within Orthodoxy, he also is getting a lot of his intellectual energy and ideas, I think, from German idealist philosophy and other kinds of European thought.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue to this next question I have, which is, how did this narrative evolve to encapsulate secular ethno-nationalism, and how effective has that evolution been?
I'll start here. It's very interesting. When people talk about anti-Zionism, and whether it's legitimate or not legitimate, anti-Zionism and Zionism are twin births. They're born at the same time. At the moment that the Zionist idea comes into being, there is a resistance to it. And the resistance to it comes from two places. It comes from, as Seth said, the ultra-Orthodox position, which basically says that Judaism is a covenant of exile. God wanted the Jews to be dispersed, and God wanted the Jews to remain in exile until which time God decides to bring them back. Right? And that's one camp. And then the other camp are kind of the German reformists who were saying, in the era of emancipation, we want to actually be a part of Europe. We want to be a part of that society. We want to acculturate, assimilate into that society, to remain Jews, but we don't see that going back to the land of Israel is something that's part of the mission of the Jewish people at this time. So you have these two warring factions that have nothing to say to each other, right? Except for the fact that they were both against Zionism. And then you have the Zionists, who were really actually the small minority of Jews in Europe at the time that were saying, no, this national project of liberation or self-determination, we have to do this, we have to break out of this. They're saying to the assimilation German reformists that emancipation is a failure, and the Dreyfus Affair becomes one example of that. And they're saying to the ultra-Orthodox Jews, you're living in some kind of outdated theological paradigm. And so there's a battle that goes on. And then at a certain point, and this goes to your question, Europe starts to collapse for the Jews. And the ethno-national project starts to become more than one option among many. It starts to become the necessary option. It starts to enter into this phase of emergency. And so the German reformists get pushed to the side, the ultra-Orthodox theologians get put to the side, and it really becomes about Jewish bodies. How do you save as many Jewish bodies as possible? And so in a certain sense, the success of Zionism as an ideology is really the result not of an internal battle of Jews, but the fact that the non-Jewish world, with the rise of Hitler in 1933, but even a little bit before, start to really create the reality that Europe is not safe for the Jews. And
Although
so,
there's
Go ahead.
Well, there's a paradox there, though, which is, of course, that Israel, and to be fair, at the time it didn't have the capacity and technically didn't exist. But it was the U.S., it was the Allies and Russia that defeated the Nazis and liberated the concentration camps. And since then, the history of Israel and Jewish safety has actually been more complex than if someone's attacking Jews anywhere in the world, Israel's just going to send over a bunch of commandos and blow them up and save the Jews. It's been a lot more uneven and inconsistent than that. And just to summarize some of what Shul was saying with a joke, you may know where this comes from, but it's the nationalist idea, the Jewish secular nationalist idea that there is no God and he gave the land of Israel to the Jews.
Right. Exactly.
This is our foundation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to note that there are a lot of parties floating around here. And by the way, we're really focused very much on Europe and so where does the Arab world, where do the Jews who are living in the Arab world, where they fit into the story? We can kind of get there. But at a certain point, I think Zionism became a necessity. Now, on the ethno-national side of it, I mean, Zionism is an ethno-national project from its inception, which really was not so different than the other ethno-national projects that happened in 19th century nationalism as well. Now, the idea of a liberal national project, which is more on the, we're closer to the American model, which now in a certain sense is becoming integrated into certain European countries as well. That really comes much later. So the idea of Zionism as being anything, I'll put it this way, I think, and this is my particular view, that Zionism always was an illiberal project. Understanding liberalism through the liberal democracy, right? That there is no ethnic preference of citizenship. That idea is something that is not part of the Zionist project from the beginning. So when people say, well, I'm a Zionist, but I don't want to be called an ethno-nationalist, well, you're an ethno-nationalist because that's what Zionism is. And we can talk about it in a variety of ways. Chaim Gantz, I think a historian of Zionism, put it well, that the core of Zionism is what he calls proprietary Zionism, that the land of Israel belongs to the Jews, and therefore it's our land, and we can decide to give it to other people. We can decide to give the Palestinians a state or not a state, but the assumption is that the land belongs to the Jews. And I think that has always been the case. I think that is becoming much more problematic and almost impossible to sustain given the present realities on the ground.
And maybe I can segue this back and also push back on at least one thing you said to the two books that we're discussing that are both came out one after the other. Marjorie Feld's The Threshold of Dissent, A History of American Jewish Critics of Zionism, and Jeffrey Levin's Our Palestine Question, Israeli and American Jewish Dissent, 1948 to 1978. And I think that the idea that you said that Zionism becomes a necessity, I think this was true in the minds of many Jews, certainly by the late 40s, the strong majority of American Jews. But these books are both histories of Jews, almost always deeply committed Jews. These weren't people who stumbled into their Judaism or just one day woke up and remembered they were Jewish. These were people who had spent time in pre-state Palestine, people who had been Yiddish speaking, who had been refugees, European immigrants, profoundly connected to Jewish institutions and Jewish values. And from the start, they had said, wait a second, it's not so clear to me that Zionism is the only answer. Or, of course, the others said, well, we can have a Jewish cultural nationalism, we can have a revival of Judaism, we can work to protect Jews without one of these Western European nation states. And I would say the big take-home, and Feld is a shorter book, and she's a great take-home person. The big take-home is that from the beginning, American Jewish anti-Zionists and people highly critical of Zionism have been called anti-Semitic, which I think functions essentially theologically. It's just as a mark of heresy. These were, people like Don Peretz or William Zuckerman were in no way anti-Semites. They were as much anti-Semites as they were, like Catholic or chickens or something like that. But second, anti-Zionism, American anti-Zionism emerged from Judaism. It is at least Feld's main contention in this book, is that the people who are tuned into it and critical of it, initially a lot in the Reform movement, were from the beginning, from the 20s, the 30s, even earlier, the non-Haredi, non-ultra-Orthodox critics of Zionism were American, and which is a real eye-opener to me.
I think this is a good. Can I just say one more thing, Marissa? I think this is a good point. I think there's a distinction that existed in the early phases that Seth is talking about between Zionism as a product of Jewish modernity and Zionism as a state project. And there were a lot, and those are not the same thing. So the American Zionists, I'm not talking about the people that Seth just mentioned, I'm talking about the Zionists. American Zionists before 1942 were basically focused on two things. They were focused on supporting the creation of colonies in Palestine, and they were focused on trying to send resources to Europe to save as many Jews as possible. In May of 1942, David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann come to the Biltmore Hotel, and they tried to convince the American Zionists by saying, you should come on board with our statist project. All of your Zionism should now be focused on the creation of a Jewish state, which a lot of American Zionists were very, very wary of because it raised the issue of dual allegiance. And remember, they were trying to Americanize. They were trying to convince America that they were not actually aligned with and had an allegiance towards a country other than their own. So they were reluctant to do that, but they agreed ultimately that they would do it. And that really changes the picture. So that Levin's book and Feld's book, they're talking about Zionists or anti-Zionist American figures before 42 and after 42 who were against Zionism because they felt that it was going to be detrimental to the acculturation and the integration of American Jews into America.
I would say that might be more true in the early phase that Feld characterizes. I mean, because what you're saying, absolutely. Both Feld and Levin have dozens of quotes about we are not no longer a nation state, or we are a religion. Right. We are American. We support American values. And you get dozens of statements like that. Maybe through the 40s, but I think that then it starts to shift, and Levin zooms in on it after 48, from through the 70s. But I think there's maybe a broader connection you can make from the early 20th century anti-Zionism and non-Zionism to now, which is these two concerns, with Jewish nationalism and what it does to Judaism. Mm-hmm. And then the second is just right and wrong. Because from the beginning, people like William Zuckerman and Don Peretz, who either were well-informed or else, like Peretz, had spent years with both Palestinians and Israelis, in the Mandate and then in the State of Israel. And Peretz, by the way, who's the focus of a lot, both Feld and Levin, but especially Levin, Peretz was the first person to ever write about the problem of the Palestinian refugee displacement. He wrote the first dissertation and the first study ever on what kicking almost 1 million people out of their homes was going to do politically, human rights wise. But I feel like the two problems of I could see running through the whole 20th century that have inspired Jewish criticism of Zionism have been, one, Jewish nationalism, and earlier this appears as the problem of dual allegiance. Like, are we more loyal to the nation of Jews or to the state of Israel than we are to America? Later on, and someone like Zuckerman always knew this, that nationalism tends to be conducive to racism, to stepping on other people, to self-obsession, and to authoritarianism. Zuckerman is very well aware of this as kind of a Yiddish socialist influenced guy. But then the second one was just the thing of right and wrong. That there's lots of Palestinians, they're human beings, they've lived here for a long time. What on earth are we doing to them? Because of course already even before 1948 there were these mass killings. The Haganah, the Irgun, IDF were doing these massive 23-to-1 death count things in terms of civilian deaths, and people were freaking out. So that I think the moral question is also a through line to today.
Right.
And so I want to get us talking a bit more about this conflation, this equivocation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. We talked a little bit before this panel, us organizers, that it's getting increasingly ridiculous to say that it's anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist. And I think I'm wondering from both of you, is there any validity to these equivocations, or in light of the historical and theological roots of Zionism?
Yeah.
So I would say within Judaism, the answer is no, there's no validity. I mean, you have a couple of crazy people, I don't know, essentially flat earthers maybe, who are like, oh, I'm Jewish and Jews totally suck, they're evil. But overwhelmingly, every single person described in both of these books is a profoundly committed Jew. And from the beginning, from the 30s, they are called anti-Semites. To the point where, as far as I can tell, the only function of it is to make you a heretic. And it's essentially a have you stopped beating your wife yet? Have you stopped selling heroin to school children question, where once suddenly you're no longer talking about human rights violations against Palestinians, suddenly now you're talking about, am I, Don Parrott's, highly committed, Jew, am I an anti-Semite? Oh no. So that's my understanding, is within the Jewish community, basically never, almost never valid.
So this isn't a new defense. It's not a new argument. This has sort of been the standard since we started envisioning a state of Israel, in the 30s.
Yeah, Feld literally has a list of quotes of people being called anti-Semitic. Like, it's in her conclusion. She just says this like hit list, and going from 1937 to like 2008 of committed Jews being called anti-Semites, and it always in every case she discusses, it's propaganda.
Interesting. And so, Shaul, yeah, feel free to jump in.
A couple of things. First of all, I think it's important, this anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, which was Jonathan Greenblatt, full stop. I think it's important to note a few things. Most people throughout the history of the 20th century who identify as anti-Zionists are Jews. Most of the people that are part of the pro-Palestinian solidarity movement, let's say, or are pro-Palestinian, wouldn't necessarily self-identify as anti-Zionist. They would self-identify as pro-Palestinian. Now, if pro-Palestinian means anti-Zionist, okay, that's one thing. So in a certain sense, anti-Zionism and Zionism is an internal Jewish conversation, an internal Jewish debate that then gets unfolded out into the world to say that anybody that's pro-Palestinian is anti-Zionist, and anyone that's anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. So if you see it as a kind of an internal Jewish debate, it's ridiculous to call an anti-Semite, and it's ridiculous to call an anti-Zionist an anti-Semite, because the anti-Zionist is a Jewish person, and as Seth said, right, Zuckerman and Peretz and all of these other people, Hans Kohn, many people, someone like Martin Buber would probably be considered an anti-Zionist today, because he didn't believe in a Jewish state. He didn't believe there should be a Jewish state. So I think that's one thing to get out. The other thing is, a lot of people will say, okay, so anti-Zionism was okay before the state. I can understand that, but once you have a state, how can you be against the state? Now, it's not clear that everyone that's anti-Zionist is against the existence of the state of Israel. There are some people who are against the ideology upon which the state of Israel is founded, because they think it's ethno-national, because they think it's inherently unequal, because they think it's a culture of domination, whatever they want to say in terms of their critique. But they would say, yes, I'm not against the existence of the state of Israel. It should be a liberal democracy. It should be a liberal democracy like America. There are Jews there. The Jews are not going anywhere. Palestinians are not going anywhere. So the idea of people saying that it's not legitimate to be anti-Zionist today because how can you deny what are you going to do with half of the Jews in the world who happen to live there? So I think it's a more complicated story. I don't know. I think that we're living in an anti-Zionist moment in the history of 21st century Jewry. I think the 1980s was a liberal Zionist moment. I think the 2020s is an anti-Zionist moment. I think the war in Gaza has really broken the argument for a lot of young people that liberal Zionism is really viable anymore, that it really offers any kind of alternative. So in the anti-Zionism is not necessarily, the anti-Zionism of some of the protesters is not saying, I'm talking about the Jews, are not saying, oh, Israel shouldn't exist at all. It's like, no, Israel shouldn't exist like this. And whereas the liberal Zionists would say, oh, yes, I agree with that, but Zionism can bring it to some other more liberal, tolerant place. A lot of these people are saying, no, I don't believe that anymore.
Well,
I think that, go on,
it seems
sorry.
like we're getting people are getting really hung up on language and their varying definitions of what it means to be anti-Zionist. And you could know your own definition personally, but someone else can assign you a meaning and assume things about you based on their own definition. And Shoel, in your book, Necessity of Exile, you talk about counter-Zionism.
Right.
And I think that is a useful frame. I think people are always looking for different ways to talk about things other than these two terms that just seem to keep coming up against each other. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that idea of counter-Zionism.
I mean, just in a nutshell, because I know it's a broader conversation. For me, counter-Zionism is anti-Zionism that's not anti-Israel. It's basically making an argument that Zionism was an ideology that created the conditions for and the reality of a state, and that in fact it has kind of done its work. In a certain sense, something that David Ben-Gurion after 1948 said, Zionism is over. It accomplished its goals. It created the state, and now we can kind of move on. Now, in a certain sense, he might have meant it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but what I'm saying in counter-Zionism is that Zionism as a political ideology of ethno-national self-determination brought the state into existence in all of the complicated ways that it did, but it can no longer provide an ideological foundation for the existence of a multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious state where 23% of the population are not Jews. The same way that manifest destiny in America in the mid-19th century, which was used to justify, the acquisition of the Oregon Territory, has fallen away. I mean, it's only white nationalists that still believe in manifest destiny. So ideologies don't have to become fused to that which they produce. The existence of something can move on, and I think that the counter-Zionism argument is that Zionism has outlived its usefulness. And now what we're seeing is that it's producing this culture of domination, which is not sustainable. And I think that in a horrific way, October 7th has shown us that.
Yeah. Seth, do you want to add anything there?
Seth, you're muted.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Yeah, we were doing some audio voodoo there. Is that good?
Yeah.
The thing I would add is that I think Shoel represents the actual arguments and ideas beautifully. There are two other forces I would say are crucial that are geopolitical. One is the interventions of the State of Israel, its embassies and diplomats, who, as both of these books demonstrate, have reacted very aggressively, very harshly, and unequivocally, in most cases, to any kind of nuance. So an example would be Don Peretz, this guy who, again, was intimately connected, had started out as a big Zionist, spent a lot of time in Israel and Palestine and the Middle East. Peretz writes the first, and this very nuanced thing about the Palestinian refugee problem. And he says, he takes a position that's like not too far from what I think the state of Israel's government wanted to say, which was he said, the Palestinian refugee issue is a big problem, but resettling them back in their houses might be impractical. He says, like, I'm not sure. There's a lot of debate. And for him saying there's a lot of debate and there's two sides, they hate him so much that there's a great internal memo that Levin finds that says, we got to short circuit this guy's career. An Israeli diplomat writes, we know his ambition is to be hired at Princeton. Let's see about digging him a grave at Dropsy College. Meaning, let's cut short his advancement. Let's cut off his voice for the crime of being nuanced. So there have been these decisive and aggressive interventions from now, and then I think the movie Israelism is a good example. At my own campus, also there's a suppressed, actually, Al Jazeera documentary about the relationship between campus pro-Israel groups like Aggies for Israel, AIPAC, and in some cases the Israeli embassy, and how there's some pretty close ties in a lot of ways. So they can be very aggressive. So that's one thing where and as Feld especially emphasizes, it's been bad for the Jews in America because debate, dissent, open-minded critical thought and creativity have all been attacked consistently for even since before the founding of the State of Israel through today. And then the other thing I just say geopolitically, ironic, especially today, of course, none of this would happen without a totally non-Jewish force, namely the relationship between the United States of America and its client states. And you look from Indonesia in the 60s with the mass murder of communists, to Indonesia's invasion of East Timor, to the Saudi bombing of Yemen. Over and over again, the US always denies genocide or mass atrocities by its client states. It always provides diplomatic cover and military support. So a lot of the fact that these problems have come to such a hideous head in 2024 also is impossible to understand without US geopolitics.
Yeah, I wonder if something I've noticed even just the last couple of days since the carnage in Rafah over the weekend, I feel like there is a bit of at least a turning point where people are starting to become more comfortable with the idea of opposing what Israel does as a state. I was just curious from the both of you if you see this particular moment in which we're speaking as some sort of turning point, and if you have viewed the same thing that I have.
I do think so. I mean, I do think that's why I said I think the war, and certainly the way the war is developing, is really giving birth to a particular anti-Zionist moment where there are people who, and again, I'm speaking within the Jewish world now, who are willing to openly embrace this idea that no, this state, this country as it exists is unacceptable. And that becomes the anti-Zionism. And I think that to basically make the claim that to say that is anti-Semitic, in a certain sense, is really buying into the anti-Semitic argument, which is that Jews are all complicit in what Israel does. So, the relationship, we have to remember the relationship between anti-Semitism and Zionism was very vexed and complicated right from the beginning, right? I mean, Herzl writes in his diary after some kind of anti-Semitic event in Eastern Europe, oh, this can be good for me with the Sultan. In other words, Zionism saw that anti-Semitism was useful for the Zionist project, and anti-Semites in Europe saw that Zionism was useful for the anti-Semitic project of getting rid of the Jews of Europe. So it's always been a very, very complicated relationship. And I think what's interesting, that what I find interesting is that a lot of people can't get their head around the fact that there are certain groups in America that can be pro-Israel and anti-Semitic. And that's what you're seeing in the Christian evangelical world.
Oh, the largest, I mean, as you know, or not as everyone knows, the largest Zionist group in America is theologically anti-Semitic, right? The Christians, is it Christians United for Israel, Kufi? They have like 10 million members, right? So that's a thing to get put on the table right away. There are more anti-Semitic Zionists than there are, if there are any anti-Semitic non-Zionists.
Yeah, I'm curious how I feel like there are many, speaking about Jews specifically now, who are comfortable kind of having these strange bedfellows with these anti-Semitic Christian Zionists. And I wonder how we explain to people that these are not your friends, or that, that just having a shared enemy is actually not enough, that these people are not representing your best interests.
I mean, I think, look, in the world of geopolitics, everybody is using everybody. So it's all just a case of, the Zionists will say to the evangelical Christians who are pro-Israel but might hold anti-Semitic views, we don't care that they're dispensationalists and they think that this is all about the coming of Christ, and then the book of Revelation is going to happen and the Jews are going to get the opportunity to accept Jesus, and if they don't, the earth is going to open up and swallow them, right? There's a kind of like mutual cynicism between the two parties. Like the Zionists will say to the evangelical Christians, yeah, fine, your theology, we don't really believe that's true. And of course, the evangelical Christians will say to the Zionists, yeah, well, we don't really believe your theology is true either, but we can work together. We can help you get what you want, because we think that what you want ultimately is going to give us what we want. Even what we want might be your destruction.
And this really connects to the 2 points that I see both books demonstrating for the first time clearly, which is that since before the founding of the State of Israel, Jewish critics of Zionism have been worried that ethno-nationalism would actually destroy the Jewish soul, and they've been worried about right and wrong. They've been worried that, exactly as Shul says, geopolitics is amoral. It's about getting what you want at any cost, except, watch the optics, but getting what you want at any cost, rolling over whoever you need to crush, because it's about power. And, from the beginning, there were Jews saying, that's not worth it. And also practically, someone like Lessing Rosenwald, who is one of the main, he's an incredibly big business leader, but one of the main figures in the American Council for Judaism, said, look, the Jewish safety is dependent on democracy all over the world. It's not dependent on having one massively armed, far away nation state. So yeah, and of course, for his troubles, they almost immediately formed a committee to combat the American Council for Judaism. So already in the 40s, another thing to remember is that this inner Jewish conflict has been violent and intense. And, the idea that anyone speaks for all American Jews has always been fake.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I just want to one comment about the Felden-Levin Declaration. I think it's really important. There has been a very, very concerted decision educationally in America from the 1970s that that is which is going to save the Jews of America, that is going to which assure continuity, is Israel and the Holocaust, is Zionism and the Holocaust. So we can call it the kind of Zionization educational project. And part of that project was basically erasing the history that Levin and Feld tell. Those people, we never learn about Dov Peretz and William Zuckerman and Rosenwald. And okay, we know about Elmer Berger because he's more of a kind of colorful figure. But there's an entire part of 20th century American Jewish history that gets erased because everything gets filtered through a particular kind of Zionism. So you have like Stephen Wise and all of these other, Abba Hillel Silver, like all of these figures from the earlier period of the century who were Zionists, but who were really the minority in the American Jewish world. So I think this is a resurrection of a Jewish history, of American Jewish history that was erased. And in that sense, it's incredibly important. Now, the question is, what young Jews who today are identifying as anti-Zionists, whatever they may mean by that, how they can use that history, because they don't know that history either, because none of us were taught that history, right? No one knew who these people were. They just fell into a pit, right? So I think that's part of the how I think Levin and Feld contribute to the moment of a lot of Jews in America starting to say, wait a second, I can't support this. And I think a lot of young American Jews are saying, we can call them anti-Zionists or whatever, they're saying, I cannot support this. I can still not support, we're not talking about occupation, we're talking about a culture of domination that has been going on for decades. I think that's a better way to see it than you get into occupation. Again, it becomes a kind of language game. What is occupation? Is it occupation? I mean, I don't think that anybody within the Zionist sphere, outside, anyone, even on the far right, would say that what's going on now is not a culture of domination. It's one group of people dominating another group of people according to ethnic religious lines. And I think there are people who grow up in the progressive world that just say, I cannot support that. So,
And I would say also that what is lighting young Jews, and I think, young people with a conscience, emotionally on fire, is a term that isn't politically correct, namely genocide, which, by the way, that was invented by a Polish Jewish jurist, Raphael Lemkin. And his whole point was that it's not unique. It's not the private property of the Jews for the Nazi genocide. It's not the private property of the Armenians for the Turkish Armenian Holocaust or genocide. It is a phenomenon that humans can succumb to doing. And, the evidence is before your eyes on social media, the genocidal intent articulated by so many Israeli figures and influential people, as well as common people in Israel. And, young people see that and they're like, just wait a second. And that lights them up. And there was the first, I believe it's the first UAW strike ever, for basically to protect people who are speaking up against the genocide. It's just happening now at the U of California.
Yeah, I think, and you mentioned these young people seeing things happening before their eyes, and it's almost insulting that they're being told, no, you're wrong for believing what you see. You're wrong for trusting your eyes. And we have social media for a reason. We have videos, we have all this footage. We're bearing witness, which is such an important Jewish idea. And we're calling out what we're witnessing, and yet that is somehow being skewed as anti-Semitic. And I think that is just impossible for them to square. And just something else I was thinking about in terms of young people is that I think there's a big fear of older folks that if younger folks are becoming more anti-Zionist, then they're becoming more anti-Jewish and are losing touch with their Jewish roots, and not anti-Semitic, but that they don't value their religion or that they don't see themselves as like a larger Jewish project. And I think I'm excited to see about how young Jews are reinventing what it means to be Jewish in this modern society, and that they are able to take their values and like Shaul, you were saying before, like sometimes an ideology doesn't suit you anymore. Sometimes a project is done, and I'm curious what you both see as kind of the changing face of Judaism in America, and how young people are making that happen.
Yeah.
No, I think this is a great point. I think that if we look back, and a lot of young people now are looking back to the New Left in the 60s. I think the major difference between the New Left in the 60s and what's going on now is the New Left in the 60s was primarily a secular movement. It was a secular movement of progressive politics. I think what's happening now, you see that in the Passover Seders at the demonstrations, you can see that in Kabbalat Shabbat services. I went to a Sudat Shlishit at the Harvard encampment. I mean, these young Jews are basically reconceiving Judaism within the context of a progressive political, anti-Zionist agenda. And I think that this is the potential, I think, of a real future. I think this is another nail in the coffin of synagogue-centered denominational Judaism as being the landscape of American Jewry. Partly the result, I would say, of the success of those institutions and summer camps that created Jewish literacy for Jews who are now taking that literacy and basically moving outside of those institutions and organizations and saying, we're doing it ourselves. We don't need a synagogue. We don't need a rabbi. We don't know anybody tell us what to do. We can do it ourselves. It started with the Jewish catalogs in the 1970s, and it continues today. And I think that that is something that really, in a certain sense, strikes very much at the heart of this kind of critique from the center or the right of the Jewish world to say, oh, because these Jews that are now in the encampment, they're not disaffiliated, ignorant, non-literate Jews. I mean, I don't mean ignorant. I mean non-literate Jews. These are Jews that know how to do Judaism. They're just going to do it their own way, and they're going to refract that Judaism through a certain kind of progressive political perspective for which the state of Israel right now has no place.
Yeah, I will.
Go ahead, Seth.
Well, I'll add that really in the past couple of months at non-Zionist services that people are creating at encampments. I mean, we saw this already at Columbia, where there was this very well-organized, thoughtful symbiosis between Jewish observance and Muslim observance and other kinds of religious commitments, and they were very well aware, that you guys are here often because you are Jews. You are doing Judaism. You're doing free-range Judaism. You folks are here because of Islamic values and human values, right? But in the past, couple months, I have learned about Judaism from services students are doing, new kinds of services that they feel forced to make up. I know students here who are researching, going into the library, picking from different sitters from their own memories. I've heard people incorporating Sephardic and Mizrahi, Arabic Jewish melodies and chants that I had never heard before in my life. And I'm obsessed with Jewish liturgy. I'm not formally a scholar of it, but I'm really into it. I learned things about Jewish liturgy from these kids, stuff I'd never seen before in the past few months. So yeah, this is a wellspring of vitality.
Can I just add one more thing, Marissa?
Sure.
Because I know that this is about language. Because I know whenever you have this kind of like the anti-language, the anti-Zionism, people push back. I think what we're witnessing right now is the de-Zionization of American Jewry. It doesn't mean that Zionists aren't going to continue to exist and they're not going to continue to flourish and believe what they believe. But I think that American Jewry is creating space for a American Judaism that is not Zionist. That's the de-Zionization process, which is reversing that which started in the 1970s, which was the Zionization process. And I think that that's healthy. It's not only healthy for American Jewry, I think it's healthy for Israeli Jewry as well. Not to have that very kind of complicated notion that allegiance to the state of Israel is what defines me as a Jew in good standing. Otherwise, I'm, what Gil Troy and Natan Sharansky said, I'm an un-Jew. That very idea, in a certain sense, is throwing down the gauntlet. And I think a lot of young people are saying, okay, we'll take that challenge.
And maybe one more image just from, and people like Howard Sakar. It's interesting, the conversation, Jewish dissent and debate on Zionism, as we've been noting, has been suppressed and erased. Interesting, and the most recent histories barely mention it. Hasia Diner does have a good section on Breira. Jonathan Sarna, no, he doesn't want to talk about it. Howard Sakar's history of the Jews in America actually kind of does and uses your term, the Zionization of America. But I want to connect it to another great American Jewish thinker and figure, Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, who was one of the first ordained woman rabbis in America. She's actually one of our family rabbis, bat mitzvah, a couple of my cousins. But she said, look, the closed, walled-off institutional synagogue with its many plaques and heavy walls and security systems. By contrast, think of the camp, the tents, an open space. You just walk up. Nobody's checking your card. She says, this is actually a pretty good metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and before we're going to get to listener questions in a moment, I just wanted to close with one more. If we are indeed in this de-Zionization of American Judaism, What does a post-Zionist America look like? I think that a lot of people, a lot of Jews in America are concerned about safety. The word safety comes up a lot, and clinging to Zionism is a way of clinging to insular safety. So if we don't have that to cling to, what does it mean to be a Jew in America, and how do we feel safe?
Yeah,
One quick, yeah.
go ahead, Seth, you go.
Oh, just really quick point about that. I may well be wrong because I mean, Marisa, I know you've done a lot of frontline reporting on this, and Shul, you know a tremendous amount about American Judaism history, but I'm not aware of any good data on anti-Jewish crime because the main people who keep track of it, the ADL, have one big bin that they sort wearing a watermelon T-shirt or waving a Palestinian flag. From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. To the state of Israel is murderous. They're doing genocide. To every aspect of transgender identity is a Jewish poison, snuck in by the Hebes to pervert our beautiful children. And they tend to put that all in one box. And if I want to be physically safe, I mean, I've been wearing my kippah more. I go to pro-Palestinian spaces. I walk around. The only time I ever get yelled at was by a secular, non-religious Zionist, by the way, for wearing a kippah. But I'd like to know the data on actual violent incidences against Jews, and I don't think anyone's keeping track of it.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, actually, and that's something I've actually thought about investigating myself in my own work, because there's a lot of perceived unsafety or perceived violence that I've heard on part of Jews, feeling threatened, feeling just unsafe in a general sense. And I as a Jew don't understand exactly where that's coming from, because I don't see the actual violence. I just see the perceived violence.
Yeah, well, a lot of it is perceived, and it's something that I've talked about with students a lot. There's a difference between feeling unsafe and being unsafe, and I think that distinction has kind of collapsed. So if a student walks by a pro-Palestinian rally and they're saying from the river to the sea, and they say, well, I feel vulnerable, I feel unsafe, that's certainly legitimate. And I don't want to take that person's feeling away, but that doesn't mean that they actually are unsafe. Because if you actually push them on and say, oh, did you feel like you were physically threatened by that? They'll say, no, I felt vulnerable, I felt unsafe, I felt offended in some way.
Or they might think that they are in physical danger, but that's also a perception. They think that a person who says that might be trying to hurt them,
Yeah.
but where did they get that idea? Why would you think that someone wants to hurt you because they're saying those words?
Yeah, and how do you separate it from that typical, like, for example, white racist anxiety that that their neighbor walking down the street who's black or who's of looks of Arabic background, that they're fantasizing that this person is planning to knife them. Right. And they're and then maybe they get in their car and they're texting and driving and getting into an accident, or they're not realistically estimating risk.
Yeah, I mean, just as an example, and then I want to go back to your point about the designization. My wife Annette Mead is Asian American, and when we were meeting with a bunch of students, and they were saying, well, I feel vulnerable walking in the street, and she said, I feel vulnerable walking in the street every day of my life. I'm an Asian American. I mean, that's just what it is. And that's what it is for a black person and a person of color. That idea of that somehow feeling safe is a right is really a kind of a product of Jewish whiteness more than anything else. But I wanted to go to your other question, because I do think that it's a really good one in terms of the next stage. I think that this anti-Zionist progressivism among American Jews is a transitional stage. I think it's going to have to actually move to something beyond that. And the something beyond that is the reconceptualization of a kind of radical Jewish diasporism, a new diasporism. What would it mean to conceive of a Jewish life that includes ritual and practice in all different forms, that is not inextricably tied to the place that I choose not to live in? Because ultimately, that's what Israel is for American Jews. It's the place they choose not to live in, which is fine. You can choose to live wherever you want. I think that that's what the de-Zionization is, and the anti-Zionism is just almost like a severe expression and a need to separate from that project and begin to conceive of a new project. And I do think that if we can't move to that next phase, it's not back to Zionism. It's somewhere else that the anti-Zionism, because oppositional politics has it just has a shelf life. It's not going to last forever. So it has to actually transition to something else. But I think to become, I would say it this way, to become non-Zionist today means first to become anti-Zionist, then you could become non-Zionist, because you've already been so embedded in the Zionist orbit. In order to break away from it, there has to be that pushback, and I think that's the next step.
I think that's a great place to end this portion of our conversation. And now we're going to get into some questions from our participants. So we're going to start with this first one. It comes from Heidi. Heidi asked, would you say the current US push to equate being anti-Zionist with anti-Semitic has originated from Zionist Jews or Republican evangelical white Christians?
I think it originated and is generated by the ADL. I think it's been picked up, certainly, by the political right. But I think it's very much, look, in some sense it's understandable, right? The ADL is in the business of anti-Semitism, so anti-Semitism is good for business. And I think that Greenblatt, and I think this is different than Fox, Greenblatt has decided that the ADL is going to be an arm of Israel. And there's something that is within the Zionist mentality. Now, this is not true of individuals particularly, but within the Zionist project, there is something, they have something invested in American Jewry being unstable. Right? David Ben-Gurion once said the biggest danger to Zionism is a robust diaspora. So that there has to be that sense of fragility that is part of the experience of being an American Jew of, well, maybe I really don't have a future there in America, right? That, in a sense, generates or perpetuates a particular kind of, therefore Zionism is necessary. Therefore the state of Israel is necessary. So I think, I do think that it's generated by the ADL, and then of course gets picked up by the political right for all kinds of their own reasons.
Yeah, and again, both Feld in a slightly broader picture and then Levin in a little more of a drilling down way shows how the claim that these, people who'd been in Europe in the 20s and 30s distributing food to poor Eastern European Jews, these people who'd been working for the Palestine the mandate, working for the Jews in Palestine, that these people were anti-Semites. That was weaponized from the beginning. As I said, functionally, it just means heretic. And I'd say that, with that certain almost animal cunning that people like at least Stefanik have, they know that, if I could be like, hey, Marisa, so have you stopped selling heroin to school kids yet? I know a lot of people are talking about your heroin business, and then you get into this, some goofy thing like, oh, I'm not a heroin dealer, and this goes on, and then anything you were actually trying to talk about gets derailed.
Yeah, I think that brings us a question that just came through from Lauren about the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, because you mentioned Elise Stefanik. If the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act gets passed, how do we cope? How do we learn? And how do we go forward?
I think it's very dangerous. I think the IHRA document was not meant to be legislation. It was meant as a working paper. It was meant as a draft. That's what Kenneth Stern said when he wrote it. And it was intentionally ambiguous. Intentionally ambiguous. When you take that ambiguity and you put it into law, then people can interpret it in all kinds of ways. And so you're taking a document that was not meant to become law, you're making it law, and then you have, depending upon a politician or a judge, you're really opening up the possibility of many thousands of people being accused of being anti-Semitic. You're creating more anti-Semites on some level.
Yeah, and the irony is that that it would literally be illegal to teach Maimonides. There are passages in the Torah that I just read that are in the voice of God, violently anti-Israel. That God, in Deuteronomy 28, God lays out a list of disgusting things that are supposed to happen to the people of Israel if they don't exactly follow the standard of righteousness. Or things like Satmar, as you know, I've learned about this from Shaul, but the largest Hasidic court in the world, the Satmar branch of Hasidism, is explicitly anti-Zionist for theological reasons. Would I be banned from, showing students a passage of Rav Yoel Titelbaum? I mean, it's freaking insane.
Yeah, it's. I think when people, I don't know, I don't want to name names, but you know when people like Lindsey Graham are your friends, you have to kind of wonder what's going on.
Yeah, and I think just one thing to add to this and the question before is like this idea that Jews need a savior, that the Christian right needs to save us, or that the ADL needs to save us. And what we're actually proving in this moment is that we're building our own very robust movement, and that we are able to ground ourselves in history and theology and make the right decisions for ourselves. And I think that is true self-determination. That is true independence as Jews. And I think that is scary to a lot of people who kind of always saw us as powerful, yet in some ways under another entity's thumb,
Right.
in a way.
If I could just quickly respond to, I mean, Ken asked a question which is good in this radical diasporas and what happens to Israel, what happens to Palestine. Again, I'm not, I mean,
I'll just read it to the group. In radical diasporism, with a healthy Judaism not attached to Israel, what's the fate of Israel and Palestine, etc.?
I mean, what's the fate of Israel and Palestine? Israel is a country. It's a country, and its electorate are going to decide what its fate is. It's going to decide which way it wants to go and what kind of a country it wants to be. If it wants to become something closer to Iran than America, then that's what it's going to be. I think it's a question of allegiance and fidelity, and whether we as Jews in the diaspora are required to support that which that nation state becomes. I mean,
yeah. I mean, one thing that again,
I'm not against the existence of the state of Israel. I just think that that it's moving in a direction that I find it more and more difficult to support.
and one thing that both the Levin documents in the most detail, I think, is that the interventions by Israeli diplomats and other folks into American Zionism early on destroyed the independence of American Zionism and made it in certain ways just a function of the state. And you can see this, people may not say that explicitly, but you can see this if you look at the memos, the correspondence, that they're intervening a lot. There's a loss of independence. There's a loss of the kind of dialogue and dissent that's almost our trademark if we're talking about a cultural style, right? Hillel versus Shammai, keeping the dissenting opinion, even if only in the margins, and fronting the dialogue. I mean, if there's anything characteristic of Judaism, at least as a way of talking or thinking, that probably has to be in there. And the suppression of that dissent, again, I think it's healthy. It's healthy for it to open up for American Judaism. And as Shaul said, I mean, Israel has its geopolitical status and foundations, and it's a separate thing.
Yeah. And so here's another question. This one comes from Jenny, and it's for Shaul. Jenny asks, "What do you see as the alternative to synagogue-based Judaism for any kind of regular Shabbat gathering among relatively large number of Jews? Where should Jews be gathering?"
Where should Jews be gathering? I mean, Jews should be gathering any place they feel like they want to pray together. I mean, the Hasidim prayed in the woods, or people can pray in parks, or people can gather in all kinds of places. I think that American Jewry made a decision at a certain point that it was going to be synagogue centered. European Jewry was not synagogue centered, certainly not in Eastern Europe, right? I mean, they had synagogues, but Jewish life was not synagogue centered. Synagogue centered was where you went. I mean, the notion of a shtibel simply being a house, a modest house where people prayed. So the American Jewish project became synagogue centered very early on, and synagogues really function very well as being the place where Jews gather together. I think that the more Jews become literate, independent, and capable of creating their own prayer communities, they can do it anywhere. And in a certain sense, it's the institutions that created that revolution, and that is the Jewish summer camps. Jewish summer camps created the decentralization of synagogue life by basically taking kids out to the woods and saying, oh, let's pray here. And then a kid saying, well, I don't want to go to some building. I'd rather pray in the woods, or I'll pray by the lake or something like that. So I think that the kind of, the Jewish catalog, Do-It-Yourself Judaism, that was the subtitle of the 1972 book. And kind of the vision of people like Zalman Schachter Shalomi and Jewish Renewal, it was a decentralized Judaism that was able to kind of function in a more organic way, where people would just create their own non-clerical religious lives. And I think in a certain way, it probably is closer to the Eastern European model than to the older American model.
And I feel like we're seeing that in the encampments, the campus protests, that they're creating these very prayerful, holy spaces, but they're not in a synagogue.
Right.
And we're seeing that it's possible, and they're showing it in practice.
I mean, we saw that in Zuccotti Park on Yom Kippur, where you had hundreds of Jews came to downtown Manhattan during the Occupy movement. I mean, the Occupy movement was really, in a certain sense, the germ cell of all this.
Yeah, absolutely. We're definitely seeing that.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Joseph. Joseph said, I have a question following up from a point Shaul made. I teach at a university at Columbia that has had lots of protests, and one point of tension for Jewish students on all sides has been the language of Zionism. For Jewish and non-Jewish anti-occupation activists, they identify Zionism as a root ideology of the occupation and the Gaza war. For other Jewish students, they register it as inherent to their identity. And so critiques of it, they see them as attacks on them. How might we navigate this in our community?
That's a great question. I think we are suffering now, or not we, but younger generations are suffering the products of what this old generation, of which I was a part, that basically created, which is this idea that being a Jew and being a Zionist, being a Jew and being pro-Israel is the same thing, and you couldn't detach one thing from the other. I think a lot of people are basically saying, I don't really identify that way anymore. And then people outside are saying, oh yeah, but you do, because this is what I learned Jews are. Jews are all pro-Israel, or Jews are all Zionists. So I think that this is a slow, painful process of kind of disengaging, or I would say kind of disconnecting this kind of idea. This is not to say that a Jew can't be a proud Zionist. A Jew can be a proud Zionist, just as a Jew can be a proud non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. I mean, being a Jew and being a Zionist are two separate things that can work together or not work together.
I would say, though, that there's a certain myth of innocence involved in Zionism, because, okay, I could be a Jew and I can like screamo, like very heavy guitar music as I'm representing. I can be a Jew and like folk music. That's not the same as I can be a Jew and a Zionist, or a Jew and a non-Zionist. It's not just a matter of taste, right? Because I think everyone who identifies with Zionism needs to ask themselves, why are there kids being burned alive in tents here? If that's not my vision of Zionism, you should probably say that. If it is, okay, you got to understand that people really hate that because it's evil. That if that's your version of Zionism, of using 2,000-pound unguided munitions on tents, that is now doing such terrible things in the world. If that is your vision of Zionism, it's making people throw up for a good reason, right? Because it's associated with atrocities now. As you know, and Shoel, I know you've written about this quite eloquently. That is not the only thing Zionism ever was, not the only thing it could ever be. No, but. And I understand emotionally, I would say personally, even 6 months ago, I was like, when people were criticizing Zionists, I was like, I heard that talk from a lot of creepy people attacking Zionists when I was younger. That, like 30 years ago, that was the thing that either super left radicals or Or actually, sometimes paranoids, Nazis, genuine anti-Semites would say, oh, the Zionists control television. But I think the valence has shifted. And, as you say, I mean, there are plenty of people who, I think still sincerely and innocently think of Zionism as just being proud of being Jewish, being proud of Israel. And, I appreciate that feeling and where it's coming from. But it's also worth thinking about what Zionism's brand is today, if indeed it is associated with these mass atrocities. Do you want to reject that, or at least say that's not my Zionism? Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the questions I think that we could ask ourselves, because I think that the people that are really on the defensive now are not the right wing Zionists. For them, this is what's happening is good. What's happening?
They're cool.
It's the liberal Zionists. They're the ones on the defensive. And the question really I think to ask is, do we think that Zionism as a liberal project is redeemable? And I think a lot of young people are saying no. I don't think that it is. I think that it has a liberal side to it, but as an ethno-national project, it will always slip back into chauvinism and slip back from there to supremacy. So the fact that now, I mean, I wrote a book on Meir Kahane, so I'm kind of like inside Kahane's head. The fact that Meir Kahane is not only popular as an ideologue in Israel, he's becoming more popular in America. Not as Meir Kahane, because he's a persona non grata, but if you hear things that people say, and I would even say things I hear liberal Zionists say, I can show you where Meir Kahane said that in 1971. Or 1969 or 1968. So the Kahanist worldview of ultimately America will turn against the Jews. And ultimately the only way that the Jews survive is through deterrence, power, and militancy. That is becoming less abnormal and more normative after October 7th. Because after October 7th, a lot of those people who held those views basically were saying to themselves, I told you so. And I think more and more people are starting to be convinced of that.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing to that from my perspective. I definitely understand this idea of being pro-Israel being inherent to your identity and feeling like you're being attacked. And for me personally, and I think this is something that students could maybe try, is first ask yourself, why do you feel attacked? What is it? What about feels like a personal attack on you? Why are you taking this personally when you are actually not there directly in Israel? You are not in Gaza. You're not being bombed. It is part of a larger culture, but like, why do you feel so personally attacked by this criticism? And then I think there's a lot of shoulds. I should support Israel and I should have a certain level of religious observance. It's something that I've felt. I grew up with extended family that was Orthodox and I grew up Reform conservative. And I always felt like, well, I'm not Jewish enough. I'm not religious enough. And it's about being able to define your Judaism for yourself and not allowing someone else's rubric to set what that means for you. And so I think this idea of being an individual and allowing your morals, your personal moral compass to guide you through this rather than external forces and external shoulds and rules will help you get to a place that is not only better for the world at large, I think, but better and more peaceful for you as a person. So we'll move on to another question. Yeah. This question is for Shaul. How do you elaborate on your self-designation of counter-Zionist? Because not opposing Israel when dialoguing with pro-Palestine activists, for whom, at least according to some discussions on recent Jewish Currents episode, claimed anti-Zionism might be kind of a prerequisite for solidarity with them.
I know that's true. I've experienced that. I think it's really this is where I think academics maybe play a role, because I think that there is the need for context and nuance. I understand that Zionism has become for many people the kind of or anti-Zionism has become like the admission card into progressive circles, and I think that I think there's a way in which the conversation can become a little bit more nuanced by making distinctions between what it means to oppose an ethno-national culture of domination against an innocent, in this case, I mean, not all are innocent, obviously, but the innocent people in Gaza getting killed, and to say that that I'm against the very right of the Jews to be able to exist and live freely in the Jewish homeland. Because I think the land of Israel is a Jewish homeland. It's always been the Jewish homeland. The Satmar Rebbe thought it was the Jewish homeland. I think the kind of fusion of the Jewish homeland and the Jewish state was part of what Zionism did. I think the Jews have a right to live there. I think the Palestinians have a right to live there. I think they both have a right to live there equally. And we have to create some kind of a political reality and ideology that would enable them to do it. So I do understand that, and I do think that that's actually a problem that has to be dealt with. But within, as we all know, some of us who were in the Vietnam War movement and anti-apartheid movement, right? Protest movements are by definition flattening. They don't really contain the nuance that's required. But again, we've got to a certain place, the semester ended, people went home, they're going to come back in the fall. I think we can really begin to think about another layer of what it would mean to address this issue, because I do think the one thing that will be the outcome of this war and the outcome of this protest movement is that the Palestinian issue is now an international issue that will not go away.
And I'd add that, of course, for universities in Gaza, the semester didn't end. It was violently ended months ago. But also that there are some students who aren't going home, who aren't leaving their encampments or continuing their engagement. And I wanted to speak to a previous question and something a lot of people have pointed up in the comments. And this gets to I think the most elaborate argument for a new diasporist Judaism to come out recently, Daniel Boyarin's book, and then a critique by the Israeli political scientist Julie Cooper, where she pointed out that, she said, that Boyarin's diasporism was kind of about cultural creativity and being cool, and Cooper said, we need institutions. We're probably past the synagogue, at the highly capitalized suburban synagogue as the core of Jewish identity. We're probably done with that. And I've been seeing people in the comments directly answering this. Here's one organization, here's another institution that, as Shmuel said, goes deep. It goes back to Hasidim praying in the woods. It goes back to to pre-kingdom Israel of the tents, the mobility, the tribal quality, and to all these forms of creativity that we're seeing right now, and that there are people are building institutions and networks to support that too.
Yeah.
Excellent. I think that's a good place for us to kind of pause and just wrap up this amazing conversation. Thank you so much both for being here. It's been really wonderful being able to guide this conversation and see you both face to face. Seth and I were trying to figure out what is it meeting? Is it what's the word for it these days? But right. to see each other's faces is quite wonderful. And thank you so much to Religion Dispatches for hosting this conversation. And it just feels like, I don't know, I got a lot out of it personally as a moderator, and I hope that everyone else did too. If you want to connect with me personally, I'm at Marissa Cubis on pretty much every social channel, and my website is thehandbasket.co. That's my newsletter. Seth and Joel, if there's anything you want to add on our way out.
No, I think this was great, Marissa. Thank you very much, and thanks to Evan, and thanks to Religion Dispatches, and thanks to Seth for really making this really. These are the kinds of conversations we have to be having. We have to be having these conversations in many different places. We have to try to break apart kind of old orthodoxies and rethink. This is really an inflection point for Jews worldwide in terms of what is our role, what are we supposed to be doing, how do we do it, what's the best way to do it, and what are the different ways that we can live as Jews in the world and as citizens of the world that contribute to to a better place. So I really thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. Seth, last word.
Well, I want to thank everyone. And actually, people raised some incisive questions in the comments that we didn't get a chance to answer, both the Palestinian and Israeli perspectives. From the Israeli perspectives, there are people who do have serious concerns for their physical safety in Israel, and what's the best way of responding to that. I just want to end with a note of grief, honestly, that if I could have a Jewish renewal that was not in some ways occasioned by the dead bodies of hundreds, probably by now hundreds of thousands of my fellow human beings, great. I'd prefer just a shitty Judaism to a genocide. But as I think you both have shown, we gotta move forward. We gotta grow.
That's
Absolutely.
good. Thanks.
Well, thanks everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful and peaceful day.